start just now. Agenda item 2 is about subordinate legislation, and the committee is to consider 5 negative instruments as listed on the agenda, and members should note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to these instruments. I refer members to the paper with these items on it and ask whether the committee has agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much. The committee previously agreed to take all further discussions on its work programme in private, and as such I ask security to clear the public gallery so that we can move into private session now. This meeting, welcome to the first meeting of the new term of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. I have apologies from Alex Ferguson. Members and the public should turn off their mobile phones and Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. And the agenda item we are starting off now is on carbon accounting, and this item this morning is for the committee to hear about carbon accounting and the Scottish Government's carbon assessment tool from 2 academic experts in the field. And I welcome the witnesses to the meeting: Professor Jan Bebbington, Department of Accounting and Sustainable Development in the University of St Andrews. Good morning, Jan. Professor John Barrett, the Department of Sustainability Research in the University of Leeds. Good morning, John. Morning. And I would invite, well, first of all, our witnesses, if they wish to say a few words, either about what they do or about the context of this, so that we can get into questions as early as possible. Would you like to start, Jan?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you. I thought it's probably important for me to distinguish for you our expertise, because we're both into carbon accounting, but carbon accounting unfortunately has 2 distinct meanings and we're 2 different parts of it. But hopefully it's actually quite helpful that we have this sort of varied expertise. Carbon accounting sometimes happens at the nation level, and that's what you're looking at in the carbon assessment tool primarily. So it's about those big flows of carbon that arise from activities within an economy. And that's where Professor Barrett's expertise lies. My expertise, given I'm an accountant, lies at an organisational level. So I have some expertise on what would you do with information of that sort within an organisation. And of course the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament itself are organisations of sorts. So it's horribly confusing because we use the same words, but we are actually talking about distinctly different layers of things. But hopefully that's a complementary expertise for you.
Good. Thanks very much for that. John, you're happy with that explanation of what you do?
Yes, I think it's pretty much the difference between an economist and an accountant, I think. So very briefly, I thought I'd give a bit of background. I provide the UK government with their consumption-based accounting emissions. We have a 5-year contract to do that. So we understand the assumptions and uncertainties associated with the method, as it is the same methodology, pretty much. And I've also undertaken this same assessment for a time series of 20 years for the UK government. So I could offer some comparisons there if you think that's useful. And then the only other thing to add is that I'm writing this section on how, for the International Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, so hopefully could give an international perspective if that's also relevant.
Thank you very much. Well, I wonder if we could consider looking at the Scottish Government, what significant progress, if any, has been made in how it tries to assess the carbon impact of the budget, for a start.
In terms of progress made and how to assess it, my understanding is that the same methodology has now been applied for a few years, and that methodology, while some improvements may have been made, it is not expanded beyond understanding what the impact of spend is. So therefore, where it hasn't expanded is into understanding what we might call downstream impacts as opposed to upstream impacts. What is the impact of the policy or strategy of those particular portfolios. But that isn't to hide the fact that it is excellent to see a wider definition of carbon impacts beyond the direct emissions of an organisation. So very much welcome the fact, and I still see this as fairly groundbreaking, that the Scottish Government does consider the carbon impacts of its spend through the whole supply chain. So I see it as an excellent starting point, but I think, I'm sure we'll get onto this, but quite soon I'd like to see, or would recommend, progress on understanding downstream impacts, increasing the policy applicability of the methods.
See something, Jan? Sorry, it's dealt with automatically by.
Oh, okay, thank you. That means I can be turned off automatically as well, perhaps.
It happens to us sometimes in the chamber.
I would echo the robustness and the novelty of the approach is absolutely there from my perspective. But from an organisational perspective, accounts have two possible functions. The first one is control, so you use the account to inform some sort of decision-making process and therefore change the outcome. The second possible function is accountability, in that in providing the account to other people, for example, like yourselves, that account can be used again to sort of focus in on the decision-making process. And I think it's on that control and accountability, which is not absent from this process, but which is maybe not fully realised in the way that would be quite useful. So we're entering the third year of seeing an account of this sort, and what is impossible to tell from the materials, but which is something that you would have the ability and the duty to scrutinise, is how have past carbon assessments informed the development of the budget, and also what outcomes might come from this assessment in the future and in planning. And so in that respect, I would see this process as dovetailing at least partially with the proposals and policies work, which is very future orientated in its nature and saying here are the things we're going to do to try to meet the climate change objectives. But what's really special and interesting about this account is it says, see that core spending and those core commitments that come through the budget, what impact do they have? And therefore these are separate kind of things, but both of them are really useful at knowing whether or not the aspiration for a low carbon economy is supported by and informed by low carbon decision making. And that's a bit that's invisible to me, but would be able to be much more visible to you with the right people sitting in these chairs.
I think we'll just let this roll just now, because I'm sure it will produce lots of supplementaries. Dick Lyle.
Thank you. Good morning. I actually have two questions. Have you any views on how the Scottish Parliament has used the results generated by the tool in the budget scrutiny process, and do you have any suggestions to improve this? And also, the second question is, do you believe that the toolkit requires revision or updating?
Two things. In essence, you've got a picture of your upstream supply chain impacts of the spend. So therefore, I suppose very broadly, there's two ways to reduce that impact. One is to reduce expenditure, so you spend less, and the other one is to spend differently or spend more efficiently from a carbon perspective. So therefore, the application of this more is in internal sustainable procurement, examining issues of what products are being is the money spent on. Could it be spent on lower products with lower carbon output per pound spent? Could we improve efficiency in general management, purchase of less paper, purchase of less computers, and whatever it might be? So to me, it's an internal sustainable procurement tool as opposed to one which evaluates policy. So therefore, the improvement, and I suppose this links to the second point, second question, is that I think it's necessary to also see an accounting system which evaluates each individual's policy's contribution to the future emissions of Scotland from both a production and consumption perspective. And to me, that's the element which would be the next logical step. That is possible. There are some questions about how it can be done, and there are a number of different pathways that could be taken, and I can elaborate on that later. But in summary, downstream impacts to me is the next logical extension.
I would echo those points because they're absolutely sort of spot on. But also what that would allow is a much more robust and ongoing policy evaluation process. So, for example, a lot of that does happen already, maybe under transport and looking at strategic transport policies, providing a carbon footprint of it and then scrutinising that to decision making. So that does happen to a certain extent, but it doesn't necessarily result in different decisions. At the moment, partly because of the early stage of these sorts of things, I think people note the carbon account with interest and either with delight, but in transport terms more with oh dear kind of feelings to it. But then it's what might happen next that's very difficult to really see flowing through within both the government and the parliamentary process. There are some sort of pointers, though, elsewhere in our economic system where you might be able to actually start to, get some of that traction going. And the NHS is a very good example of it. They've got very good carbon footprinting information, much the same way as this kind of account looks at supply chain upstream and operational impacts. And one of the things that they realised when they did that is that 60% of their carbon footprint is in their procurement side of things. So, of course, it's running hospitals and lighting and heating and all that sort of thing, but a lot of it's tied up in procurement. At the same time, a lot of that's tied up in drugs. So that they know if you and I never have to swallow anything or never have to turn up to a hospital, that's a low-carbon strategy. It's also a tremendous strategy for you and I in health and well-being terms. And so a few organisations, not a lot, but a few, mainly those who have been working at their carbon footprint for 8 to 10 years, are starting to do that more whole systems analysis, which is really what my colleague was talking about as well, is actually, this is a fine account, but it doesn't get you right out into the whole system. Now, some of that data, as I said, does exist in various transport assessments and those sorts of things. It certainly it must exist and be informing the proposals and policies work, because I feel like that's modelling different ideas. But I think the people who are starting to do really quite interesting things are thinking about the whole system, not just their wee bit of it. And of course, as policymakers, the whole system is up for grabs and in your hands. So in terms of the toolkit, I wouldn't revise how you calculate the numbers, because that's robust, but how that might be used in conjunction with other sorts of accounts and other sorts of processes is entirely open to development and building on.
We're going to move on to the environmental input-output model questions just now, and Dennis Robertson is going to ask the next one.
Thank you, Convener. I think just to ensure that I get the question out in full, I've asked actually one of the clerks to read it out on my behalf, or yourself, because I want to ensure that the question is in full.
So, what are the positives and negatives using a methodology that does not account for the emissions that arise as a consequence of spending decisions, for example, road use? I think.
Well, the first thing to say is that for the methodology for calculating your upstream emissions using environmental extended input output is recognised both by a number of European institutions and academically as by far the most superior and leading method to get a full picture of the supply chain of spend. So I think it's the correct choice to have that methodology in place for that particular analysis, and there are been a number of European studies which support that. However, so that in a way is, I suppose, is a positive for that method. The negative part of it is that the model is what would be described as static. It gives you a snapshot of 1 year and the efficiency of production for that 1 year, and therefore doesn't necessarily give you a particularly valid understanding of the future consequences of policy. And input-output analysis, that's not its purpose or its strength to do that. So the static nature of the model is its issue. To try and describe this without getting too technical, if we spend £1 on a product, input-output looks at the current structure of the economy to see what the impact of that is. But of course, when you spend £1 on a product or anticipated £1 on a product in the future, then that will actually change the structure of the economy, and it doesn't necessarily predict that very well. So basically, there's non-linear relationships in the future, which it doesn't predict, because obviously it changes the economy depending on where you allocate the spend and so on. So to overcome those problems, there are a number of economic modelling techniques to do that. some relying more on probabilistic methods, some relying more on scenario approaches. But there are a number of modelling outfits in the UK that spend a lot of time working out the detail on what the consequences are of implementing particular strategies, and there are methods to do that. They partly relate to input-output, they use input-output, but they have a rich combination of additional information on how economy behaves depending on where you place your investment and what the subsequent emissions might be.
So we have to equate that to an example, say, of building an infrastructure, a road, and then projecting a forecasted usage on that road of, obviously, transport and their emissions. Is that where the problem lies in equating the accounting?
The accounting at the moment will tell you, the accounting you have at the moment will tell you what the carbon implications were of building the road, all the whatever goes into building a road, asphalt, whatever it is. It's not a road building expert, as you can tell. But of course, it doesn't tell you then the fact that people might use that road more and it may induce further traffic and create additional emissions. So that's the analysis which a more economic scenario type model would tell you. And those kind of models are used in transport planning to some extent, but they haven't been used so much in maybe looking at the whole infrastructure and capital investment programme and how that changes how people may live in the future, changes how industries may function, and changes how they may use mobility and transport systems and so on and so on. So that's the bit which I would say is needed now.
Just on that point, thank you, Convener, good morning. I mean, obviously, you know, we talk about road use, and some people already have a picture of increased car usage and more emissions, but by the same token, we could have increased public transport, we could have increased bus use and fewer cars, or we could have green buses and very low emissions. So, and electric cars, indeed, as one of my colleagues has said. So, you know, it would be important to ensure as we go forward with the sophistication in measuring output that we take into account, which I think you were alluding to in terms of reference to societal changes, all the changes, the very important changes that we hope to see sooner rather than later.
Absolutely, and that's what your proposals and policies document seeks to do, is actually seeks to lay that out. But I think the key why this is such an important assessment of the budget itself is that in the budgeting process, a series of things are set in play that you would either have to clean up later by a modal shift in transport, or that would have to, you know, well, they're locked in which case it's very hard to unlock some of them from that. And in particular, I think the usefulness of this carbon account is at the time that the money is allocated. And I'm sorry, I'm an accountant, that's of course what I'm going to sort of focus on. But at the moment at which you commit the money, you're actually committing future carbon, which is not at all unchangeable, as you note, but which is actually, to a certain extent, quite hardwired in.
Good morning. Some of the issues that I would like to ask about have been sort of discussed already, and I think certainly for me and for all of us here, although we've got a very strong, well, I won't speak for everyone else, but for myself, I find some of it quite challenging in terms of the assessment. But I'm wondering if either of you as witnesses could tell us about, in relation to Scottish Government, that there have been arguments put forward that a comprehensive assessment of the use of impacts is very challenging and quite difficult to do. And I wonder whether you know of other administrations or organisations that are taking this approach.
I think there's some examples in DEC with energy modelling and planning the future infrastructure for a low-carbon economy. They have an energy model which does exactly this. It looks about where investment would be placed and what the consequences of that investment are to the future emissions, and whether that meets with the Committee on Climate Change future carbon budgets, bringing a whole raft of issues based on uncertainty of outcome and so on. So these models do exist in some areas of policy. In transport, you'd see some planning. You see some sort of forward projections on how a particular intervention might relate to different emissions. So it does exist, but not comprehensively. We also undertook a study for RAP, so Waste Resources Action Programme, where we looked at 13 resource efficiency strategies for the UK and how, if those were introduced, they could contribute to emission reduction. So these assessments exist, but no one, I think, has taken forward a comprehensive annual assessment of their policies and how that changes the future carbon emissions. In terms of it being difficult, well, it's not easy in that you would need specialist support, but there seems to be quite a lot of expertise already in the Scottish Executive for some of these elements, maybe not all of them, but they do exist. And to me, it comes down to how important it is to understand what the future carbon emissions of different strategies and policies are. And if that is a key policy agenda, then I couldn't understand how you can move forward without knowing that information, even though there is uncertainty, of course, in the outcome, and yes, it may be difficult in some areas. So, for me, it's a necessary requirement to know which policies to implement and to be able to assess whether they're working, and finally, I suppose, to be able to assess the contradictory nature of different policies pulling emissions in different directions. So there may be a comprehensive road building plan alongside a plan for pedestrianisation and for increased public transport use. And it seems to me sometimes that the issue arises in not what do you fund, but also what do you not fund. And such a model would help, I suppose, give insights into that.
Could I just come back on that point? Thank you. Could I ask if internationally as well there are examples of where such assessment has been shown to directly follow through to alterations in policy which have had effect?
I think some countries are more strategic than others in the way that they use modelling to guide policy. I think there are examples of investments in wind energy in Germany where they forecasted how bringing in a feed-in tariff would affect future markets and how that infrastructure investment would contribute to emission reduction in the future. So there is some quite comprehensive modelling that underlies policy decisions. One thing I would suggest is that I'm not sure if it's necessary to go through and initially assess, let's say, how the portfolio of justice, for example, might affect future emissions. Probably not significantly is my initial assessment. I think, to me, there would need to be some upfront assessment to establish which policies are likely to have an impact on future carbon emissions and therefore prioritise what's looked at as opposed to trying to address how an area which has very little consequences on carbon might have.
Thank you, Kavina. Sorry to delay things, but just in terms of that question, just to push it a bit further, do you know of examples where, for instance, if you used the example of transport and any shifts towards a more low-carbon transport method, which we're all aiming for, whether there are examples of different departments working together so that the effects on health and on other areas such as just in different departments that there might be an effect on, whether you know of the joined up thinking that might be happening. Sorry, it's rather
joined up, that helps.
Right.
My examples, again, because of my discipline, are pulled more from an organisational basis, but some organisations have invested substantially, even though it is challenging and difficult and the numbers won't be entirely exact, trying to look at exactly the question you're asking. British Telecom did a very interesting piece of work where they modelled their what they hope is their likely increased business activity and business revenues, and then figured out how much more efficient they would need to be to track the Climate Change Act reduction trajectory. So what they did was that they picked something that they thought, well, if we could be in line with that and everyone else would, then collectively we would get there. So they shaped their choices about a range of things using that. So that's an example where somebody's picked a piece of legislation that's in place and say, as an organisation wishing to be best practice, can we actually do that? And they have, them along with other organisations, have their own marginal cost abatement curves. So which initiative to pick first that will actually generate it. In terms of the different departments and the trade-offs, an example that I came across recently, and this was for a piece of work that was sponsored by the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, what they did is they were looking at water companies were working really closely with the environmental agencies to figure out whether or not they had the consenting right. So if you are releasing water into a natural watercourse, it has to meet a minimum standard in terms of pollution in it. And that standard is set at the lowest level that the water is ever likely to flow in that watercourse, because that way you've got the risk correct, you've got the right direction of error. However, for a lot of the time, the water is a much higher level, so you could actually treat your water less intensively and save carbon in that respect, and release it at a relatively dirtier, if you like, level, but you'd still have the same biological outcome. So the outcome you're seeking would be the same, but the method by which you got there would be slightly different. And what the water industry and the environmental agencies have realised is that there's enough real-time water data to actually start to do that. But also some water companies will share their real-time both pollution and river flow data with the environmental agency, who might not actually have that data, and they have a relationship of trust that they might be able to look at what they call agile governance or variable consenting. Now that doesn't exist yet, but that's, if you like, when you've got good enough carbon data and you've got a good enough idea about what your outcome is, you're in the realm of actually moving forward quite a bit. So that's not a technical solution so much like green buses or whatever, even though happy about green buses, but it's a solution which is about governance and relationships and how people interact together. So that social technology, if you like, is also likely to be really quite important, because we designed our existing regulatory regime in this example not for the low carbon world, but for a different world. But now we could actually, through clever ways of thinking about doing and relating with other people, actually achieve quite a big reduction quite quickly. So that's the example that I know best of not different departments in this instances, but different parts of the system having a really strong conversation with each other to achieve an appropriate environmental goal, but also a lower carbon way to it.
Just a little technical point for John Barrett. It's been the Scottish Government since 2007, but it's officially so now in all of our dealings, not the Scottish Executive. It's all right. Anyway, it's a small matter. But we're going to continue to look at the input-output model and move on to Annabel Ewing.
I think it's Graham next.
Is it?
On
Graham?
consumption.
Number 5. Sorry, beg your pardon.
Thank you, Convener. The assessment takes a consumption-based approach. I wonder if you could outline for us how you would consider what you would consider to be the advantages or disadvantages of that, and that if we were starting from scratch again, is this the approach you would take?
Yes, it is the approach I would take. It gives a more complete picture of the emissions associated with spend, and if the overall goal is mitigation and to reduce emissions, then it is not the most important issue as to whether those emissions were inside Scotland or outside Scotland. The global goal is clear, and a tonne of carbon is a tonne. So that's that. So in that respect, I think it was a correct decision to take, and one which has many advantages and shows a broader definition of responsibility. So I very much praise that. Negative. I suppose there is an increase in uncertainty in assessments, more than territorial emissions. We've undertaken an assessment for DEFRA, and we gave recent evidence to the Energy and Climate Change Committee on that level of uncertainty, and there's additional uncertainty between 3 and 5% associated with the calculations. But I can't perceive any real negatives to trying to really reduce carbon in that respect.
The other really positive thing associated with it is it's consistent with the domestic effort target within the Climate Change Act in Scotland, which is one of the elements of the Act which I think shows real leadership and aspiration, and that you're not sort of punting it offshore and saying we're great but we're doing it elsewhere. So in that respect, the consumption basis is absolutely spot on and consistent with that aspiration.
Okay, and now Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I have a question about so-called induced emissions, which, as far as I understand it in this debate, concern the idea that you would look at somehow the amount of emissions that would be again, so-called induced by domestic spend resulting from higher government salaries or public officials employed by the government or anybody else who, they control the salary of. And I just wonder, apparently before, the Scottish Government had included this as a part of their modelling in the assessment, and going forward they're not going to include this. And I just wondered if you would care to comment on your views on this particular approach. I mean, it seems to me, and I'm a lawyer by practice, not an accountant, and they famously say lawyers can't add up, but it does seem to me that you get into the realm you were talking earlier of uncertainty, and it does seem to me that you would then have to make a whole series of assumptions on how this increased salary would be spent, which I think would beg some questions as to reliability, and I wonder what the uncertainty factor should be for that, and I wonder what differentiation would be made for times of recession versus times of not, and also behavioural change in people's attitudes to their spend, which I think we talked about a wee bit earlier, the importance of people changing their behaviour. So I just wonder, you're the technical experts, what's your view from a scientific perspective, an economic perspective of this particular approach on induced emissions?
My feeling is it's a step too far in that to understand the carbon emissions of households, basically, and how they spend their salary. This is a bit of maybe I'm being too subjective here, but to me that's their choice on how they spend the money. And I don't know what policies or practices you could put in place to affect how people chose to spend their salary. It's pretty commonplace in these kinds of accounting to ignore it. All organisations ignore it. It was ignored in the UK government study when they did the 20-year time series of the impact of their spend, and it's been ignored in all assessments that I've done for organisations.
I'll take in the wisdom of that choice to ignore it as well, for two reasons. Firstly is that if a reduction in carbon is achieved by, say, impoverishing all your civil servants, then that's not a very sort of bright idea to do. Don't get any ideas. I can see it going around the room. The people in the background don't look as happy as you guys do at that, okay? And so in that respect, and this is reflected in this to a certain extent, is that there's slightly less carbon tied up in this budget because there's less money to spend. Now, that doesn't make it a good thing. So it's very difficult sometimes with increases or reductions in carbon to unambiguously know if it's good or bad. And so in that respect, the context of that would have to be important. And that's why the induced emissions, you don't know if it's good or bad. But the other thing as well, and this links very firmly to the other thing I think Scottish Government does incredibly well, is using the National Performance Framework. If you look at that framework, carbon isn't the only game in town. Now, it's a very important part of our policy domain, and maybe it's very critical for future prosperity and well-being, but it's not the only thing you're trying to do. So if, for example, you targeted the carbon-intensive bits and found that it was all the health service, you think, well, let's close down the health service. That's not going to be a smart idea either. So I think it's really about increasing the nuance and the ability to understand what the carbon means, which is where my opening reservations about this is that it's not interrogated to an extent to really understand, well, is it good or bad? And the answer always is, unfortunately, maybe because I'm an accountant, is that it depends. It depends on the context of it. So for those reasons, I think leaving induced emissions out is absolutely wise, but also it points towards a more sort of systematic, nuanced, and that will come with time, use of this kind of data and other data of its sort.
D, first of all.
Thank you. Just a small question following on from that. If you disregard certain things or leave them out of calculations, how accurate a measure is the carbon assessment tool providing of performance?
It depends what you say it's an account of, because as I said before, there are several accounts that account for different things. Mm-hmm. So I guess the only thing I'd be keen on is that it's visible that it's out, and therefore you know what's in and what's out. And if it's in or if it's out, that it's consistently applied, so you might have some grip on what the trend is doing as opposed to a singular thing. But it's also the case is that the kind of thing that we're looking at in induced emissions are the kind of people who have possession of that salary and are using it are subject to the same kind of opportunities the rest of us are to catch the bus or to walk or cycle or whatever. So in some ways, leaving that particular thing out doesn't mean that it's not addressed anywhere at all in the system.
Okay. And Annabelle Ewing again.
Thank you, Convener. And just leading on from that, another question that sometimes people ask is whether the Scottish Government's approach could be extended to encompass the use of what could be termed social and environmental data, and I just wonder what your thoughts were on that. It may again be subject to the same kind of caveats that you've just outlined with respect to induced emissions, but it would be helpful for the committee to get some input on those issues.
I understand it's then beyond a carbon analysis to include other environmental concerns and social concerns into the analysis. Yeah, from that perspective, carbon is easier to do than other ones because it very generously distributes itself evenly, has an even effect globally. Some pollutants don't, so therefore it very much matters where they fall and where they are produced, and which isn't the issue with carbon. So you are entering a world of considerable complexity once you wish to consider sulfur dioxide emissions or other such emissions which have a more regional or local effect. So while it may be useful for an overall assessment, it will not link well to impact. So there are issues with that. There are issues also with data and extending the model. So without a complete knowledge of all the data sets in Scotland, it wouldn't be easy to extend this study without probably further assessment and research would be my educated guess. Yeah.
I'd second that. So, for example, water accounts. There's guidelines for how to do that, but it really depends how much it rains and what your catchment is and all of those sorts of things. The nearest thing that the Scottish Government has and uses, I think, quite appropriately, is the ecological footprint. Now, that calculation is no way near as exact, or will never be as exact as the calculation here of the carbon, but as a way of shaping a conversation and a discourse and an understanding about the kind of impact, broader environmental impacts of what's going on. That's quite important. And then things like the equality measurements framework and some of those sorts of things, so a distribution of environmental harm and environmental positive things by income groups and various groups that we might be interested in equality terms, would also then provide, if you like, a social insight into this. And so some of the work that has been done within the equality measurement framework and some of those sorts of things, so just getting a distribution of, well, who generates the most carbon from transport, for example, it depends how much money you've got. So some of those sort of unpacking of things on an equality line actually gives you a pretty good glimpse into some of the social aspects. And as I say, appropriately used, the ecological footprint is a really good discussion point, but not an exact one, but a good discussion point in the nature of our lifestyle and the impact that has taken together, bearing in mind that that has larger data problems, but is a way of getting a glimpse of that.
This is going to make very interesting reading when we go back and look over what's been said just now to keep up with this. But what are the advantages and disadvantages of a methodology which relies on industry carbon intensity averages rather than real emissions figures?
Okay, I might need to understand the question more, but my general feeling is that this methodology does rely on absolute real figures. It divides them by the output of each industry sector before it runs through the model. It is complete in its accounting structure and does account for all the carbon of every pound spent. So in that case, it's extremely thorough. One thing which I think is probably lacking from this report is a carbon intensity figure, because if the carbon's just going to go up or down depending on how much you spend, then as Jan suggested, that's not really telling you much about your performance. So it may be useful to know whether for every pound you spend what the CO2 is, and therefore giving you an insight to that. And also then on the carbon intensity side, you could also remove very easily over time the underlying improvement in the efficiency of the economy to know whether that's the reason for your reduction or whether it's because you've actually changed in policy internally. So you could combine the use of absolute figures with carbon intensities to gain a more precise figure.
I have nothing to add to that.
Good. That's what I like to hear. I think that was interesting, because we're saying we can develop the policy, in other words, by having two forms of measurement to deal with there. Yeah. Well, I want to look at influence on spending decisions now, and Jim Hume is going to ask a question.
Yes, and good morning to you both. It's been previously stated, and I'll quote it, carbon costs need to be weighed against other objectives that spending programmes are intended to deliver. Do the witnesses agree that the previous carbon assessment has or hasn't actively influenced spending decisions in the Scottish Government?
It's hard to agree or disagree, because there's no evidence base to be able to make that assessment systematically. I can't imagine it hasn't, but there's no tracking of that from period to period. So in some ways, this carbon account sits alone and sort of says, well, there, that's what it is. And so actually, sometimes it's that narrative, I think, that for that to be brought to the fore more explicitly would be really helpful for a committee of this sort.
I've seen no evidence on its use. Maybe it's been internal and hasn't been shared with the public.
Following that up, can either of you see how it could be developed, improved to allow it to influence spending decisions? And any thoughts?
Yes, well, my feeling is that its greatest application. Well, firstly, is obviously the extension to understand the downstream consequences of these, and that would obviously help spending decisions, and that to me is the most important extension that's needed. But just using this data, to me, it would be good that this data could actually start informing internal sustainable procurement strategies, and that's, to me, its greatest application. And one thing is to identify the high carbon intensive activities in more detail, and actually question whether those particular items should be substituted for something else or simply not purchased. And until it has an impact at that level, then the data that we have at the moment probably isn't being used to its full capacity.
Development of individual level assessment. Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Chair. Morning. What advantages and disadvantages are of individual level assessments, and whether these are in use anywhere else? So,
yeah. Being by individual level.
The Scottish Government has in the past stated that the carbon appraisal of individual policy measures and specific spending lines will need to be better understood, and to better understand the carbon implications of individual strands of government activity.
I think that question points to what John's already spoken about, is actually extending this data set and this model to deal with those elements would be very important. And it's again not to say that it's entirely absent, but it's not consistently present in various activities and lines of thinking. So in that respect, I think we're on the way there. It's this kind of data, but extended to that, what happens because you've had a particular policy is where it comes into it more firmly. And I think this is where the proposals for policies and proposals and policies that's laid before the Scottish Parliament to say this is how we think we're going to meet the climate change targets, that often looks at extra discretionary activity that will order be able to reduce the carbon in the system. I think the individual level assessment that you're talking about here would actually then address, well, how do you reduce the carbon in the core, not about an array of additional activities, but to capture them all. So I think that would be really, really helpful and important.
I'd just add to that the model needs to be applied at the level where decisions are made. So if spend decisions are made within these different portfolios, or even at a lower level than that, then that to me is where it would need to be applied.
I wonder if you could kind of just follow that up by saying a little bit about how that could be applied. I think that would be helpful.
So, for example, to me it was about spending decisions then. So if within one of these portfolios they are thinking about replacement of electrical equipment, for example, they have a number of options. They have the ability to could implement a sort of a longevity policy and tell everyone that they can't have a new computer and that have an upgrade system which could have considerably lower carbon. They could purchase particular types of computers which have a lower carbon impact. They could also purchase ones which they know will have future lower energy use. And if whoever makes that decision, also being in a large organisation, I'm never quite sure whoever makes those decisions, but whoever does make that decision really would need that information available to them, and also then be questioned and held accountable on whether they did or didn't use that information adequately to justify their decision.
Thank you. Yes,
Dennis Roberts. Do you believe then that would encourage the manufacturers of such equipment to actually promote that they're actually coming up with for instance, computers, if you use an example, which have a low carbon emission, and in terms of the production, it was a low carbon impact that they were using. And do you think then that would encourage more competition and less carbon emissions throughout the whole industry?
I think government is in a unique position to do this. With the spending profile of £33 billion, I would hope that the government could help influence influence business decisions significantly. And it wouldn't surprise me that if you implemented and said we will only buy machinery which reaches a certain standard, that standard would be met fairly quickly by people wishing to sell to you. So I'd be very confident that it could have a positive impact.
To come back in on that then, are you aware of any other governments or countries where they actually do use this method?
Well, I can tell you a sector. We have common purchasing policies across all the universities in the UK because it's the only way we can actually pool our money to be at a level to be able to buy what we need on a diminishing budget. So a lot of the public sector is in joint purchasing arrangements with exactly that kind of aim and outcome. And it's particularly important in the energy rating side of things because there's some really good evidence that producing, this building's rated, I mean, everything's rated now, but that rating exercise has led to something called choice editing. And what that means is that if I'm a shop and I'm going to give you an array of different brands to have a look at in white goods terms, then I will stock A and B of every different brand, because I now know that, because I want to keep the brand open, but I'm now looking at an energy thing. And what that did very successfully over time for white goods and things that are labelled with that energy rating is to actually drive innovation and move people towards just producing the best. So in that respect, that sort of collective purchasing or purchasing on particular outcomes, of which low carbon would be one, but wouldn't be the only outcome that you might be interested in, is enormously effective.
We want to think about the results relating to the draft budget for this year. Dick Lyle.
Your answers there are very interesting, and actually if you take the government spend plus local government spend, you'll near enough get into something between 40 and 50 billion pounds, and basically the procurement could better procurement could actually reduce emissions and reduce the carbon content. Anyway, can I turn to the assessment of the 2012-13 draft budget? States that emissions impact of government spending can be traced back to similar sources, and this is where it touches on the point you're making: electricity production, etc. The result, the carbon intensity of spending across portfolios is very similar. Do you believe that the methodology is sound behind the assertion that the carbon intensity of spending across portfolios is very similar?
Yes, so it'll be consistently applied across every product, across every portfolio, and therefore I would suggest that it would be able to provide meaningful comparisons on the carbon intensity across them. Yeah.
Okay. Have you have a further point?
Well, basically, again, just to get into the point of spend. A couple of weeks ago, my wife wanted to change to have a certain light, so I had to go and get the better, the low intensity light, which is, when you buy an ordinary bulb, used to be 45p. Now these bulbs are £3. Does that induce people to reduce their carbon footprint or to reduce their, what they're doing? You're saying that government could make a better spend from procurement. Could we encourage manufacturers to make a better spend for ordinary people if they reduce prices?
I think, yeah, sorry. But price is a very strong driver of people's purchasing decisions, so yes, I think it will. Without getting too heavily into light bulbs, but I would hope that light bulb would last longer. So therefore, its cost per hour of illuminescence might be lower overall, so you need a greater capital investment for the product. So maybe there is a job in communication education, but also I'd be very keen to see intervention to make sure that the lower carbon products cost less, and I think that there is considerable more work to be done on ecological taxation reform and other areas to move towards that system. Yeah.
The only thing I would add is that whole life costing, which is an approach to looking at that longer term versus the shorter term, would probably support that kind of decision. And whereas you might not expect individual and households to necessarily make those calculations up front, I would expect institutions to be quite sophisticated in making those calculations for best value reasons. And it's public money, and therefore that kind of thing should actually, if it is more expensive but it's better in the longer term, that should be a natural outcome of a decision-making process about value.
Do we decide then, if you can explain more about why the rural affairs and environment and infrastructure and capital investment tend to have higher carbon intensities?
My understanding from the assessment is that it's partly because of the balance of what's sitting underneath that, and agriculture is a particularly fraught carbon intensive place. But if an activity that falls under your remit is intensive and appropriately intensive, then it's not about, it's about making that less intensive over time. But I would have said it's maybe just naturally falls that way because of the activities, not because there's anything particularly odd or remiss about the combination of those elements, if you know what I mean.
We know that land use is quite a big emitter. Mm. We know that new structures like building bridges and things like that could be the same, and therefore that's possibly why, in our case, we're concerned that the things which we're responsible for and infrastructure, capital investment, are in the spotlight here.
You're right. You're right that it's these are more carbon. They're more carbon intensive because the products which are purchased have greater carbon intensity. But this is why it's so important to have the downstream impacts, because if, for example, that capital infrastructure was to build a significant portion of wind turbines, then its downstream impacts would far outweigh any of the upstream impacts. And therefore, it's worth the carbon investment, I suppose, to get long-term gain. So that's why you need that additional information to balance the information on spend. Those particular departments might be spending efficiently, and you can't tell that from just that top line figure, which is why the need for supplementary information both on this and also then the inclusion of downstream consequences.
Good. Thank you very much. Thinking about parliamentary scrutiny, Margaret McDougall has another question.
This year, all the committees in the Parliament are required to consider how climate change has been considered in determining the spend of all Scottish Government departments. Could you make any suggestions as to the type of questions committees could ask ministers across all portfolios?
One of the key things, which is one of the limitations we identified, or at least the invisibility around this process, is how this data did actually influence decisions. So ministers, there may well have been a whole series of thought processes which aren't evident from documents that sort of come out at the end of the day. So I would be asking for more than one and concrete examples of how this kind of proofing process has played through. And in particular, to be looking for those decisions that were significant. So if somebody, told me that I was at some organisation and they told me they put, Dyson hair dryers in all their gents' toilets, and they're an energy manufacturer, and so I'm really pleased they did that. But actually, it's totally immaterial in their total carbon. Their carbon's driven by their energy mix. So in that respect, I'd be keen for committees to ask, well, how significant are the stories that might emerge about how tools of this nature played through, and actually to be proofing for looking for significant things, not things that are nice to haves but maybe only deal with a small amount.
Something that the Committee on Climate Change did quite well, I think, in their last progress report on the carbon budgets, was to recognise that the top level figures don't give enough insight into whether we are progressing to achieve future goals and future budgets. And they came up with a set of indicators by which to assess whether they had the necessary investment in place, because obviously there's significant time lag in the decision to invest to when something's built and to when it's operational and reducing carbon and so on. So I would suggest actually asking specific questions, if it's related just to this spend part, would be to draw up some indicators to assess the progress that they're making, such as how has this information affected and changed your sustainable procurement plan? Do you have a sustainable procurement plan? How is it implemented? What evidence do you use in the decision making? And how can you kind of point towards specific policies which have actually reduced carbon in spend and so on, as opposed to just relying on the information, because the information is the top line indicator. It doesn't tell you enough information of whether they're doing well or not. Although I would like to also see a more, I'm getting a bit repetitive, so sorry about this, but it's the downstream part which I really would like to get departments to be thinking about the consequences of their policies.
We have a particular issue here about the state of development of the measurement of the effect of re-wetting peatlands. And the government's done research on this, and we're particularly interested in it as a potential spend item. Do you think, from your knowledge, that we're at a point where we could say that some general expenditure on this would be a very useful thing at this stage in the budget, because of the potential size of the carbon sink that we're protecting?
I'm quite happy to respond to that in terms of the land use policy work that went on a few years ago. I think what that identified is actually whether or not climatically carbon stores get disturbed, or whether or not through human processes, farming practices or land use practices, they get disturbed, then it is incredibly important. So I think understanding those carbon stores, particularly in Scottish soils, well, not just in the peatlands, but also other soil structures. I'm not a soil scientist, but I talk to soil scientists who tell me that that's where a lot of the big money's at, and big carbon, keeping it locked is the key. The best way to deal with climate change is not to let it out in the first place.
Good. And was there a follow-up to that? Or
in a previous life, I'm on about contract and preventative spend and also contracts. Do you think there should be within a contract a section which defends a council if they take a decision to give someone a contract that they've reduced their carbon usage footprint, or reduced the if they had a contract from a contractor 100 miles away, but the person who was 50 miles away from them actually maybe a couple of pence dearer, but the carbon reduction, because of the fact that they're closer, makes it a better contract. What do you
Audit
think about
Scotland
that?
would be scrutinising that spend, and Audit Scotland have a best value duty with regard to sustainable development, which would incorporate not only carbon advantages and disadvantages, but other things as well. So I think the mechanisms are there for that to be able to be seen as best value in an appropriate way. But the key would be whether or not Audit Scotland has enough of a sophistication to be able to do that. Now, I know they are not totally uninformed about that area, but in the last year and a half or so, I've lost touch with what's happening in that internal process because I don't have any access or authority to be involved in that internal process, and so I don't know whether or not it's a timely question to ask them about how they would view such a scenario as that. Because if you're a local authority and you think Audit Scotland is going to sanction you for that kind of choice, you can see why you'd be risk averse about that and maybe not make it. So actually, maybe that's something for Audit Scotland to help as an enabler in that process.
That was exactly the answer I was looking for, because of the fact that sometimes Audit Scotland do go back to people and say, well, you shouldn't have done that. But if it reduces the carbon, along the whole point you've been making this morning, because councils and government have a massive amount of spending. Thank you.
Could I add to that? And that is that decision cannot be made with inadequate evidence. You often see someone quote say, we'll go for the local supplier, but the local supplier might be incredibly inefficient in their production methods. So don't always assume that the transport component is the greatest impact. That's what people have done for years with food miles. Food miles represents a fairly small proportion of the impact of food. It is in the production and processing where most of the impact happens. So therefore, as long as the information is there and the assessment is complete.
So probably we're looking for optimum value rather than best value. Easier to actually assess some of these extra elements that Dick's been talking about. That's been very interesting indeed. It's given us a good setup for our further scrutiny of the RPP and the budget, and we thank you very much for coming along to give us such good-humoured and well-informed information. And no doubt we'll be seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have a 5-minute break just now, just before we move on for comfort purposes, etc.